Okay, in terms of the stuff, the deadlines remain unchanged. So, quiz and assignments part 1, deadline February 1st, exam 1, quiz and assignments part 2, deadline March 1st, exam 2, quiz and assignments part 3, April 5th, exam 3, 4, quiz and assignments part 4, April 26th. And these are all end of days, lunchtime to 9 p.m. And then exam 5, the exciting final, covering all the things. If you need to take it, the deadline's Wednesday, May 1st at 5 p.m. So, slightly different day. There's a KISSA, College of Social Sciences, Arts and Humanities meeting today, 3 to 3:15. So, even if you're not a major, I'll be there in my office. So, if you're looking for me in my office, I'll be over there. But if you're over there, I'll be there too. Okay, before pressing on to our new stuff, anything about any previous stuff, or stuff that needs more? Okay, so last time we were continuing our adventures in Chapter 3, and looking at the notion of how to organize, write stuff, and now we turn to look at persuasive writing. Now the book presents this all from the side of good, but for the sake of completeness, we'll also look at it from an opposing viewpoint from the side of evil. Now, as mentioned before, to use a metaphor, critical thinking is analogous to being concerned about the nutritional value of food. So when you're assessing, like, should I eat this, the main question from a nutritional standpoint is, well, first is it poisonous? Second, is it on fire? And you look at the list of what's in there, like, what does it have in terms of carbohydrates, sugar, cholesterol, vitamins, etc. And so a good food from that standpoint would be one that has the nutrients and carbohydrates and calories that you need. And a bad food would not have that, or would have things that would be potentially harmful. Now, in terms of assessing nutrition, taste would be like irrelevant. So it wouldn't matter whether it was like super delicious or not. If you're just concerned about nutritional value, that's what you're concerned with. And the same with critical thinking. Critical thinking, by analogy, is not about how persuasive or appealing or nifty it is. It's about, is the logic good? Is the content good? Now, but of course, for a practical matter, when we're going to eat food, we don't just look at the nutritional value. We're also concerned about presentation in some cases, but definitely with flavor. So we generally prefer things that taste good, that may be less nutritional, over things that may be more nutritional but taste worse. Now, in critical thinking, of course, continuing metaphor, our goal is nutrition. But of course, it's not like one or the other. You can have food that's good for you that is also good to eat. And so taking a similar approach to critical thinking also makes sense. If you're going to engage in argumentation to prove your point, it would be somewhat foolish to not take advantage of persuasion, to present a good, solid, logical case, hopefully with true premises, but also make it appealing. There's no reason to intentionally make it not appealing. So this, technically speaking, isn't really like critical thinking, because it's irrelevant to the truth and falsity of it. Just like in nutrition, if you're assessing nutritional value, how tasty or well presented it is doesn't matter nutritionally, but of course from a practical standpoint, it does. So here are some recommendations the authors make on the side of good, and then of course we'll also look at them on the side of evil. Now, one thing which does tie into critical thinking is this. Whenever you're arguing about an issue, the thing to focus on is the issue, the person's view, their position on the issue, their arguments, rather than going after the person themselves. Now, the one obvious exception to this is when the person is the issue. That's what is being argued about or discussed. But if you're arguing with someone, the idea is, the standpoint of being persuasive, to go after their view rather than the person. And the reasoning behind that is supposedly attacking the person is off-putting. Now, from the standpoint of actual critical thinking, this is, of course, to avoid committing what's called an ad hominem fallacy. We'll see more of this in the future. The basic idea is attacking a person doesn't do anything logically about their claims. So if someone says terrible things about Donald Trump, it doesn't disprove his claims about needing a border wall or not. That's independent of what you think of Donald and his personality. Likewise, if someone attacks Nancy Pelosi, who doesn't want the wall, it proves nothing about her view. Because simply attacking a person proves nothing about the truth of their claims. And we'll see more of this in the future. Now, on the side of evil, if you've seen politics at all, or how people interact, this can actually be very effective persuasively. I mean, logically, it's terrible, but think of, like, for example, Donald Trump, the president. His kind of deal, for the most part, is simply attacking people. He doesn't really, like, get in there and engage with all of the arguments and policies and nuances. He usually just rips into people with nicknames and insults. And it is relatively effective for him. He has a solid base that is sticking with him. Similarly with other politicians, even, non-Trump politicians, it's kind of stock and trade. Instead of saying this person's views are bad, they go after the person. For example, and they're often like racist and sexist as well. This year we can expect, next year, sorry. The election is like 600 days away, but it seems like it's here. There are a lot of women planning to run for office. But what they're going after is not so much, I mean, they do go after traditions sometimes, but a lot of it is about whether they're likable or not. Typically they don't do that about male politicians, or going after how they dress, etc. And so that can be quite effective. Terribly so, but quite effective. So aside of good, always stick to the issue, because that's what the professional thing to do, and logically that's the only thing that makes sense. But on the side of evil, going after the person can be extremely effective, because most people, they don't make that logical distinction, and if they see you scoring points on the person for them being like fat or unlikable or whatever, you can score a lot of points that way. Next, tone. Now, from a professional standpoint, you would want to use a generous and sympathetic tone. In a way, this may seem kind of like perhaps outmoded. You sometimes see it parodied, when people are pretending to like be speaking politics from like ancient times, where they say, forsooth, my good and esteemed colleague who has the brains of a wildebeest, yet I, of course, have the highest respect for him. And the idea is, of course, to, even if you're saying terrible things, to have a tone that is generous and sympathetic. Now, one part of it is, of course, it seems more, professional, and we hear people lamenting today about how politics is so, dirty and crude, and they long for the days that never were, when everyone was super civil. Now, especially in a professional context, that's like professional. So if someone is acting, really awfully unsympathetic, then that can be perceived negatively. They can seem unprofessional. They can seem crude, rude, obnoxious. Also, it's very important when one is kind of in a power disparity scenario. For example, years ago, one of my former students came in and said, I'm going to a court case and I'm going to be arguing in front of the judge. Here's my opening statement. Can you look at it for me? I'm like, sure. And he starts off by like insulting the judge and insulting the legal system and just going on a rampage. And I'm like, I'm sure you feel all this stuff, but you're probably not going to win if you start off by just attacking the judge. Because even if they're a reasonable person, they're going to be thinking about how you called them, all these terrible names. They're not going to be thinking about how good your arguments are. So as a practical matter, good tone can be very persuasive on the side of like good. Now on the side of evil, being terrible can be quite effective. Again, sort of the exemplar of this is Donald Trump. He does not engage in a generous and sympathetic tone, but he's president. Very successful. Other politicians, of course, also, and famous YouTubers are very mean and obnoxious. And although standards kind of change over the years, many people who are popular and successful are pretty obnoxious. And so this can be effective, because there is a certain appeal to being kind of, edgy and insulting and attacking. And so on the side of evil, this can totally work. Now, generally you got to know your audience. Being all, if you're a lawyer arguing before the Supreme Court, probably best. If one is like getting involved in like a gutter knife fight over political office, yeah, that's probably not a good choice. Third, one thing that often like weirds people out outside of academics, especially philosophy, if they read the writing of a philosopher, is, well, friends of mine says, I write, stuff, don't read sterile. And my friends will say, I have no idea what your position is because you're always, so reasonable and you're always willing to consider the other side, so why do you do that? And I said, well, that's philosophy. You're looking for the truth, you're not looking to score points or win. And so you concede when the opponent or someone else's view has good points. You concede that the good is in fact good. And it's kind of hard to do. Now in academics, of course, this is kind of the standard, because supposedly, not always, the goal is truth. So you have to say, yeah, the good is good. And there are plenty of other things to fight about. Also, it makes a person seem like they've considered the position, that they're reasonable and generous and willing to compromise. And so even in politics, one could say, well, if you're willing to say that your opponent has some good ideas, then this shows that you're a reasonable person. And that can be somewhat effective. Now, on the side of evil, again, if you follow American politics today, this is like what must never be done. You can never concede anything to the other side, because that is treachery. It is highest treason. Everything the other side does has to be terrible. Now, the reason why this is done is because psychologically, if people are polarized, to yield anything to the other side is to be a traitor, is to commit treason. Because if one side is utterly committed to their views and the other side is utterly committed to theirs, any acceptance of the enemy is like being tainted. It's like hugging a demon or something. It's like you don't want to do that. And so when you have extreme polarization, you can never concede anything, because the other side is not just different views, they're not only wrong, they are demons. They are the worst. And so today, if it's like in politics, this can be quite effective. So just ripping the other side, and nothing they do can be good. It must all be terrible. And again, it's work. This is kind of the politics of today for the most part. Lastly, and this one is perfectly neutral, although it does, as we'll see, it does have an evil application. Now, if you get limited time, or if you don't, you always want to focus on the important points. Now, one sort of important critical thinking skill is knowing what's important and what's not. Like when you're arguing or debating about an issue, there are some things that are relevant but not very important, and there are some things that are really important, and hence, they're the ones to focus on. So you kind of have to know like which part of the discussion, etc., the matter, is most important. And to use an analogy to academics, quite literally, if you're doing a paper and one part is worth 5 points and another was worth like 50, you want to put your focus on the 50, because if you pour tons of work into the 5, you get 5. And if you shortchange the 50, you get way less. Similarly, if you were focusing on an issue, you're trying to do a business presentation, etc., you'd want to consider what is my most important stuff. You don't want to get dragged off into irrelevant things. For example, one way this becomes kind of problematic when you're being argued against is that sometimes people often focus on unimportant things. Now this can actually be an effective tactic, because if you can get the person focused on things that are relevant and losing those points, then it can seem like they've lost their major point. For example, suppose the issue is whether companies, when they got that big tax break, the claim was if you give them a big tax break, they'll take all that money and hire more workers and reinvest and raise salaries. That was the claim. And suppose, person's writing an article and they argue they're obviously not going to do that. They're going to use it for stock buybacks primarily. And suppose that, you go back and look at what's happened, and someone says, well, this one company, increased its salaries, and here's, therefore you're wrong. Now, it may be true that, say, an example person you're supposed to only mention, like Apple Computer, and Apple, does raise salaries. And the person says, well, you're totally wrong because this company uses an example, Apple didn't do that. Now, that would be relevant, but it's not the most important point. Because the person could say, okay, yeah, Apple did pay out some more money, but in general, what do companies do? If the answer is, like, they use 9% of the money to buy back stock, then you'd be right. I mean, you would be wrong about the minor point. Yeah, I was wrong about my example, but the major point still stands. Or, like, to use a kind of comedic example, if you see Rudy Giuliani talking about stuff, he'll say, like, he'll focus on, yeah, this part's not true. Like, someone might say, no, it's not true, we paid $145,000 to a porn star, we paid $140,000, so no problem. It's like, yeah, that could be true, but it's not really relevant whether you paid $140,000 or $145,000. Or if Hillary Clinton said, it's not true that there were, my server was running, Linux, it was running Windows, it'd be like, well, that's not really the point. The point is, it was, you had the server. Or someone says, I didn't murder him by shooting him, I did it by stabbing. It's like, okay, that is different, but that's really not the point. So on the side of evil, not when writing, but if you can get onto the trivial bits and contest those and get people to buy it, that can be effective. Because people will think, aha, that doesn't hold up. They're wrong about this one tiny point, so they're wrong about everything. Which of course is bad logic. And it can be a real fight, because people will fixate on like one mistake and think that ruins everything. Okay, so those are some persuasive techniques on the side of good and on the side of evil. Now, so when do you go good or evil? Well, the thing to do is know your context and audience. If it's like an academic paper, yeah, it's not good, unless the goal is to like write an edgy paper. If it's in the case of politics, probably the side of evil. Last thing for chapter 3, writing in a diverse society. Now, language, again, really important. And many of the battles over equality, oddly enough, they don't all involve just language, but they do involve, how language works and how people are referred to. So, basically 2 reasons why I want our language to be diverse. One, of course, is a practical thing, clarity. So we know what we're talking about, and we're clear about what we mean. The second part, of course, is ethics. If we value diversity, equality, etc., then we want our language to reflect that. Now, people might say, well, why would that matter? But, of course, how we think generally in language, we're thinking about stuff, and if we accept certain words, that affects how we perceive reality. So it's the lens through which we see the real. And so controlling language helps control perception, which controls how people see reality. Now, of course, if someone going to the side of evil, if someone doesn't believe in like equality and diversity and so forth, they would want to do the exact opposite. They would be arguing vehemently about using words quite a different way. And you can actually see this in the battles today about whether you should use inclusive language or not. Now, to demonstrate like how people's concepts kind of like affect them, there's an old, not really a joke, I'm not really sure what it is categorized, maybe like a riddle. Everyone gets it today, but I remember years ago when I first heard it, people were like, who could this be? And of course the story goes like this. There's a father and son are in a car, they get in a wreck, they're badly hurt. They go to the hospital, the doctor says, I can't operate on him, he's my son. Who's the doctor? And people were thinking, it's the real biological father, and the other father is the adopted father. Or it's like, he means he's a priest too, and it's his like son from church. And people generally think, oh, the obvious answer, the doctor is his mother. Yeah, because if the father and son are, driving, both get in an accident, and the doctor says, I can't operate on him, it's my son, then the answer is that's the mother. And people used to puzzle over that, like, who could this be? Because there was a conceptual disconnect between doctor and female. And similar language, things like chair person, that says, as opposed to chair man. And so whenever much of our language is loaded up, or using the term he, if you say, the department is looking for a new chairman, he will have the following duties. And it may not explicitly say we're looking for a guy, but it kind of implies that. Now, today one of the big battles is over gender. And of course, there's a lot of philosophical and scientific and political battle here because people can't even agree what is sex and gender, etc. And of course it's super controversial. But kind of the neutral idea is this. There's genetic biology, what kind of chromosomes you got. There's physiology, what kind of parts you got originally. And then of course there's the gender roles, which are kind of like being on a sports team. I mean, in a way they're kind of real, just like being a first baseman or a striker or a quarterback is real, but we kind of create those roles. And if you follow the so-called culture wars at all, there's vehement, angry battles over how do you refer to people who identify, they're genetically male, but they say that they're gender female, how do you refer to them? And of course people on the left say you refer to them how they wish. If they want to be called she, you call them she. And then people on the far right say no, they're still he. And everyone gets angry and they fight about it. And people sell a lot of advertising on YouTube. I think that's the main reason to sell advertising on YouTube. So, what to do? Well, that is largely a moral question, because if you're on the liberal side, and you'd want to avoid gender discrimination by using the pronouns that people prefer. People on the right would generally say, no, this is an abomination, this is wrecking language, restoring social roles, so we'll go with the biological, genetic terms. Now, what if you want to just avoid all the controversy and just not get into it when you're just trying to write a paper? Well, the easiest thing to do, fortunately, these days, is to break an old supposedly grammatical rule. Instead of using he, just use they. And the they singular is now okay. And that's what I use now, just to avoid troubles. I first got into this when I wrote a blog during the Manning case. It makes it a painting man for some reason. But there's a person who did the WikiLeaks thing, and then they were getting their gender changed, and people got enraged that I was referring to them as he. But yeah, but my reply was, well, he was he when he was doing this, but I didn't really know what to do. So now I just do everything in they, just to avoid trouble. So if you want to avoid discrimination, or just to avoid trouble without getting into the battle, the easiest thing to do is just, instead of use he or she when it's clear what the person identifies as, and just use they in all their cases. Problem. And it avoids that awkward, switching from he to she, etc. So, thank goodness for the singular they, because that solves a lot of problems. Now again, this doesn't settle the deeper philosophical, moral, political battle over, what are genders and what are pronouns and how should it go, will it destroy Western civilization, but kind of the easy thing to do is just
Now, I agree with the approach just to avoid gender discrimination, but does that not cause your writing to lack clarity because it's not specified explicitly?
It can, because you'd want to, if you're referring to particular individuals, then you'd want to go with he or she, and then it becomes a moral question. In 90% of cases, people, there won't be an issue. But in cases where you're referring to a particular person, you can want to see how do they identify, because otherwise you could be dragged out on Twitter for that. Yeah, and so also just for politeness for them. Yeah, so if you don't know, best thing is just they, or if you're referring to particular people who clearly identify themselves as he or she, just use that. And it's the same thing I do. If I'm referring to President Trump, I refer to him as he, and referring to Nancy Pelosi, she. If it's I don't know. Or just, if I'm doing generic, like talking about people generically, I just use they. But yeah, it's a good point, because if you use they, your language might seem confusing.
So you don't do that in your philosophic writing, but you'll do that in writing that is going to be presented to the whole society.
But I do it philosophically too, because often philosophical writing is neutral. Instead of saying, if someone does this, he is evil, I would say if someone does this, they are evil. So that way I avoid any because evil's an all, equal opportunity endeavor, so I just use the neutral pronoun.
Do you think that would help a lot of older philosophy be more inclusive? Because I've read once that like a lot of people don't feel that older philosophy is characteristic of the experience of women, but also like minorities and stuff like that. But by just saying they, then like it kind of opens that back up.
Oh yeah, older philosophy can be super racist and super sexist, because philosophy is predominantly been like white old dudes for forever.
Yeah.
So a lot of the stuff, even though you get a case where like you have philosophers who put forward theories that are neutral, but then in their personal life will often be incredibly sexist and racist, and sometimes that will kind of seep into their philosophy, even when it shouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
A good example would be like the United States. You have people like Washington and Jefferson. They are like, well, yeah, they accept Locke's idea, everyone's equal, justice, and they're like, oh, about slavery, that's okay. And so you end up with this dichotomy between their ideas and their actual practices. And also, as you noted, philosophy's been predominantly pretty racist, just like all of academics, pretty racist and pretty sexist. And it's been kind of a struggle to kind of change that, because when you have people kind of locked in, and they're not only it'd be difficult even if people were just kind of neutral, but you have active hostility in some cases. Like some of the stuff I've seen myself over the years is just you wouldn't. It's a real eye opener and shock to think of academics as being like, you think of them initially as like, oh, they're smart, they're wise, they do all this thinking, they're going to be like, they're not going to be racist. Then you're like, oh my God, they're as bad. No, in a way they're worse, because they have a theory and they should know better, but they're still terrible. Not all. I don't want to say everyone's terrible, but you do see there's a lot of disappointments in academics. I said too much though. I'm giving you a glance.
I know you're fine.
Behind the screens. Unfortunately, it's improved. There's been actual efforts to make academics far more inclusive, which of course comes under attack, because then people say you're all a bunch of snowflakes, and you're pandering to feminism or race identity, and then you just say back, well, we just think it shouldn't be all old white guys like me. Like, that's terrible. Not terrible. But anyways,
Thank you.
you're welcome. Yeah. So the general rule, from the standpoint of critical thinking, is unless you really need to refer to like gender or ethnicity or sex, then the idea is to be neutral. Like, as you say, the problem there is that by excluding people, like just like in philosophy, when someone's reading it, they're like, this doesn't include me. We're, this is talking about, just all he's or all, people of a certain ethnicity. Now, of course, in cases where it would be relevant, so for example, you wouldn't talk about his abortion, but in neutral cases, like you're talking about good or bad, you'd say, if someone does this, they are bad, or if someone does this, they're good. And to close, again, there's a huge moral, political debate here. But from a practical standpoint, if you want people to feel included in your writing, then neutral writing is best. That way it'll endure longer. And years from now, people won't be saying mean things about you in cultural studies classes, which will be fine. Okay, recapping chapter 3. So what are the important things to know from 3? Our main thing in 3 is, the beginning was clarity. And we saw that things can go bad because of vagueness, which is, language is too imprecise, too fuzzy. Metaphorically, being in a cloud. More precisely, the term, phrase, the meaning of it is not precise enough for the purpose at hand. We also looked at ambiguous, in which there's 2 or more possible meanings, and it's not clear what is intended. So go in the driving metaphor, you're driving along, the road splits, and there's no sign. So you're like, this way or that way. And we saw various flavors of ambiguity. Semantic is based on the meaning of the term. The way to fix that is either give more context, like instead of just glasses, like drinking or reading glasses, or to swap out, a word that's less ambiguous. Syntactic is the structure of the sentence, and the way to fix that is restructure the sentence, or add more words. Grouping ambiguity is where it's not clear if you're referring to individual or group to group. Like, doctors or nurses make more than doctors, or tigers eat more than people. We also saw the problem of ambiguous pronoun reference and overgenerality. We also looked at a couple of fallacies, division and composition. And then, of course, we slid into the definitions, which is definition by synonym, where you do it by putting in a word that means the same, by example, by giving examples, analytical, by saying here's how it's in this group, but here's how it differs from that group. We also looked in terms of the way definitions are used, like the precising definition to make it less vague, the stipulative definition when we say this is what this old term means now, or here's a new word, and this is what it means. And of course, we also look at the lexical definition. This is how people commonly use the word. And then there's also the rhetorical definition, which you'll see in the future, whose goal is to make people feel negative or positive so that they agree or disagree, kind of preloaded. And to use them, we'll see this in the future, but metaphorically, it's like either putting some like sugar on the term to make it more tasty, or sprinkling on some dirt to make it less tasty. Then we looked through argumentative essays, a little bit about writing and completeness, and then we finished up. Before getting to 4, in our remaining time, anything about 3 that needs more 3 stuff?
You said when going after bad, always go after the person, but when going after good, always go after what?
Yeah, on the side of evil, on the side of good, you'd want to not attack the person unless the person is the issue. So if you're debating, say, the ethics of gun control or border security, on the side of good, you wouldn't rip into Trump or rip into Pelosi as a person. You'd stick to the merits, like what are the reasons to have the wall? Are these claims true? Is this good reasoning? But on the side of evil, you would just rip into the person. You'd attack them, say they're cowardly, they hate America, etc. Now, on the conceding the good is the good, on the side of good, what you do is you be rational. You'd say, yeah, there are some good points here, some good ideas. And the reason why that can be persuasive is if you're dealing with a rational audience, they say, oh, this person is not insane. They're willing to consider the good as good. They're open to these ideas. They've thought it through. Now, on the side of evil, you don't want to concede anything, especially when things are highly polarized. Because as a practical matter, as we see in politics now, since we're so polarized on the extremes, to concede anything is not to compromise or get along, it's to lose. So every compromise is a loss to the demons, and that's just unacceptable. From the standpoint of polarized politics, on the side of evil, you don't want to concede anything. And that's kind of where politics kind of is today. Although, sort of interestingly, as people push to the extreme, then have more people in the middle who are willing to compromise. So hopefully they'll do it. But yeah, so the idea of conceding the good is good on the side of good. If something's good, then yeah, you should say that's good. See, it makes you seem reasonable, like you thought it through. But again, on the side of evil, you don't want to yield anything because you want to make them fight for everything. And as a practical matter, if you're dealing with sides that are highly polarized, if you concede anything, you will have lost. The audience will just say, oh, they're a traitor. No, I'll listen to them. Anything else? Any good examples of that today are in politics. Like you have a moderate Republican who's willing to compromise, they get wiped out. Like the guy, Jeff Flake, not really super moderate, but like Jeff Flake, a lot of the Republicans just stopped because if they were willing to even compromise a little, that was totally rejected. They would get the primary. And also, we saw in the Democrats, not as extreme, but we saw old sort of middle of the road Democrats getting wiped out, people on the far left, and because people didn't want to compromise, they want the extremes. Okay, anything else? Okay, chapter 4. Now, our objectives in this chapter are as follows. Our main focus will be on credibility. Now, this has always been important, because we've always, in the modern times, had to deal with sources of information. Ever since we've had people talking to people, we've needed a way to assess their credibility. Now, of course, it's exceptionally important today because of, well, we have charges of fake news, alternative facts. Anybody who's familiar with, technology and social media at all is aware of like Russian bots and other, the Russian operatives and others getting into, Twitter and Facebook and of course on websites and promulgating fake news stories. Well, Americans do it too. It's a big money maker, creating fake news sites. And so we have a vast, tsunami of untruths pouring over us every day through Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. And so the question is, how do we tell what we should accept, what we should reject? And some experts have claimed, this helped sway the 2016 election and is also heavily polarizing the United States. I mean, going back to people being heavily polarized, these things are campaigns designed to split people more and more, typically by elections. So in doing this is what we need to do. First, we need to assess the source. And an important distinction we'll look at is between interested sources and disinterested. Now, not in the sense that the person is like bored with it or not bored with it, but in the sense of having a stake in it. Also, kind of our check on claims, which claims that are not supported by arguments, will involve running them up against our own observations, experiences, and background information. Also, going back to the thing about sources, if you see something on Facebook or it's being tweeted around the Twitterverse or it pops up on YouTube, we'll want to be able to evaluate sources. How likely is the source is true, how objective is it, and how accurate is it going to be. Now, evaluating sources, the better we are at this, requires us knowing stuff. And we'll assess them based on, does the source know stuff, and are they experts? Also the biasing factor. Now, we've heard, of course, about the idea of fake news. You probably have heard the president talk about all news is fake, except news that praises him. And this is not something new. I mean, Trump takes it to the extreme, but going back to at least Nixon, there was the claim that the media is liberally biased. And so we'll see about that. And so our objective in a way is become more skeptical at assessing, the media, traditional media, and also the Twitter and the Facebook and the YouTubes. And of course, advertising, because the whole point of Facebook and Google is to throw up ads so they get money, so we buy crap, so other people get money. And so naturally we'll look at defending against advertising. And of course the best defense is just ignore it. They have plugins for like Chrome and Firefox that just take out the ads. And maybe they have one that replaces ads with pictures of like kittens and puppies. I guess that would be pretty cool. So, in this age of fake news and Russian bots and the YouTubes and the Twitters and so forth, how do we deal with the tsunami of untruths and pull out that true stuff? Well, fortunately, even though it seems like a vastly complicated thing, you got Twitter, you got Facebook, you got Russian bots, you got fake news sites, you've got altered videos, you've got, intentionally distorted camera angles, intentionally, distorted editing, outright lies. So how do you get through this? Well, the fortunate thing, much like with arguments, there essentially are two simple ways to defend against it. And if you can focus on these, not guaranteed success, but it's a pretty good defense. Now, there are, of course, all kinds of dangers. Pre-social media, there were the usual things like scams, good example, like when email first came out, quickly the email scams, like someone saying they're Nigerian prince, and if they have these millions of dollars, if you give them their bank account number, they'll give you a lot of money, blah, blah, blah. And people fell for that quite a bit. When I first saw them, I thought, no one could fall for this. But one of my friends is in banking, that was her full-time job. She went in 40 hours a week, you know, and she was the Nigerian prince and damage control person for her bank. Now, of course, today, we have all the usual suspects. We have the old, you know, person scams. We got phone scams. Like the one where they call people and, you know, they say they missed their jury duty and they need to, you know, they got to pay a fine in the form of an Apple card or an Amazon gift certificate, which is kind of weird because you know, kind of when I heard that, it struck me as odd that people believe that the Leon County wants you to pay them with Apple Apple gift cards, but there you go. But again, people do fall for that. It is kind of scary. And then, of course, as we got into the rise of Twitter and Facebook, then we, of course, have the concerted Russian, you know, disinformation campaigns, and then we have, you know, foreign and domestic groups or individuals trying to stir up trouble on Twitter and YouTube, etc. And so all kinds of dangers out there. I mean, probably the best example that people point to is, of course, the 2016 election, which was clearly influenced by the Russians. This is not to say that Trump didn't win anyways, but the Russians were clearly heavily involved in that. And so literally our democracy is in danger. But also individually we're in danger because people try to scam us, you know, with medical products, with making us afraid of things, trying to sell all these things to us. And so literally our lives are in danger because plenty of us know there can hurt us and kill us. As a final example, you know, of course, the phishing scams. Everyone's got, if you get an email, you get the email forwarded to you from your bank or Apple asking you to go and put in your information. But of course, it's a fake site and they're stealing all your stuff. And some of them are, you know, obviously stupid because, you know, the people at Apple or Bank of America know how to spell. But others look perfect. You know, you take it to a site that looks just like the real one. And you wouldn't know unless you know, happen to check the security certificate or we're kind of wondering, you know, why you're getting this. I mean, one useful bit of advice is, I have a public email, but I also have like emails with like weird, unguessable, you know, things, and I use those for my banking stuff. And no one's gonna know about this. I use them just for my financial stuff. So if I get, you know, something from like my bank on my public one, I'm like, yeah, that's not real. If I get something from my bank on my really weird unknown one, then probably from my bank, but still not guaranteed. So how do we sort through this? And I said that there are two basic tools, and here are the two tools. First thing is this: assessing the claim itself, because claims inherently have credibility or lacking. Now, credibility is this: whether you're talking about a claim, a credible claim means it's more reasonable to believe it than doubt it because it's probably true. It has, to use an analogy, it's like it's got credentials. You know, metaphorically, it's got like a passport. And you're like, yeah, this is probably okay. But of course, like anything, it could be forged. A source's credibility, similar deal. It's not that the source is true, it's that the source is probably trustworthy. Again, metaphorically, they have like their passport or their ID, so they're probably who they say they are, and they're probably saying something possibly correct. So the first thing to ask yourself is, okay, does this claim itself make sense? Is it something plausible? Now, one problem that comes up, of course, is that when it's especially when it's a charged issue, politics, ethics, people go by how they feel. So it's not so much, is this true? It's sort of like, do I feel angry about this? And if people feel, because in politics, people want dirt and crap on the other side. And so if they hear something, you know, horrible, they really want to believe it. It's kind of like if someone doesn't like another person like in everyday life, and they hear like a rumor, like, oh, you hear that person, you know, they got that disease or they were stealing stuff. People want to believe that because they want to believe terrible things about people they don't like. So the thing to do is ask yourself, okay, setting aside my feelings, especially if I really want it to be true, is this something that makes like sense? For example, when it was claimed that Hillary Clinton was running a child sex ring under pizzeria, it was a Cosmic Pizza, is that plausible? Now, it's not impossible, that it's not like it's, entirely impossible for that to ever possibly occur, but it would be really weird, especially since the place doesn't have a basement. So there couldn't be, of course you could say, well, maybe it's, like the Batcave, it's hidden there. And so a claim like that was believed. And you might have heard last year someone went there with a rifle, an assault rifle, with good intentions. They wanted to rescue the kids, but of course it wasn't true. There's not even a basement there. And Hillary has other stuff that she does besides that.
What do you do when like the claim is made from a credible source, but it's fallacious? So like, remember those like milk commercials, like, yo, got milk does the body good, but then nowadays we have popular information that says that like cow milk isn't the best for human consumption. That came from a credible source. The information was delayed, or the claim put out there as if it should be digested, but we now know contradictory information. How do you address a situation like that?
Yeah, good point. Because even if the source of the claim is a credible one that's believable, like the FDA, etc. One thing, of course, is they can always, even credible sources and even credible claims can be untrue. Because the idea of drinking milk is good for you, as a claim, does seem initially plausible. Because like when we're kids, that's what infants drink, and milk has got like vitamins and minerals. So the idea that it's good for you sounds reasonable. But it also, you said it comes from a credible source. Now, you make an excellent point that it could turn out that a credible claim from a credible source could be wrong. And food's an excellent example because, take for example eggs. In my lifetime, which has been super long, eggs have been like, eat a bunch of them. Then it's like, this will kill you. Then it's like, it won't kill you, but don't eat too many of them, to, this is super good, eat a lot of them, to, have one a day, to, it will kill you. I think now it's on, like, have one a day. And so, yeah, it can be really confusing when you have seemingly credible sources, nutritionists, etc., making seemingly plausible claims, but they could still be wrong. Now, so you do raise an excellent point. Credible claims could still turn out to be untrue, and credible sources could still be wrong. And seemingly insane claims could turn out to be true. You'd be like, who knew? Who knew that would be terrible or good for you? And, weird sources could turn out to get things, normally sources that are, very dubious turn out to be right. For example, I think that one of the tabloids broke the Gary Hart story. Gary Hart ran for president, and the press thought he was having like an affair, and he dared the press to follow him, and they did follow him. They caught him having an affair. That's why there's no President Gary Hart. That was back when having an affair could get you you were out, you were done. Apparently now you can have like, yeah, I think it's coming out. Yeah, it came out recently, which is good because I use that example because that's from when people are like, who's that Gary Hart guy? That's who he was.
So basically what you're saying is that a credible claim from a credible source can still be untrue.
Yeah, a credible claim from a credible source could still be wrong. It's probably true, but could turn out to be wrong. Likewise, a claim that's not credible from a dubious source could be true. But from a betting standpoint, you generally want to go from, if it's a credible claim from a credible source, probably true. And so if you're betting, you'd bet true. If it's not credible, it's not from a credible source, you'd bet either suspend judgment or probably not true. But it could, keeping in mind that credible claims from credible sources aren't guaranteed true, and claims that are not credible from non-credible sources are not guaranteed to be false. So the first thing to ask yourself, is this claim plausible? And the answer is yeah, probably believe it. Keeping in mind, as you said, that it may turn out, yeah, that was not. For example, one that was on the A1 show today, they're talking about terrorism and paying ransoms. Now, intuitively, we think if you pay ransoms to terrorists, they'll keep on doing it because they get money. And so the U.S. policy has always been we don't negotiate, we don't pay. And so you think, yeah, that would intuitively, that should be the strategy to take. But there's an argument that actually doesn't work. You actually get more people killed, and it's not very effective. But it seems plausible. If you don't pay terrorists, you think they would stop doing it. But it turns out they're happy to get Americans anyways, because then they can kill them and put it on YouTube. So. Now, the source of the claim, the question would be there, is this source a good source? Is it, as we'll see in the future, is it objective, disinterested, do they know what they're talking about? So how do you assess the claim and its source? Well, again, our currency is credibility. Now, there's two sorts of credibility. It's kind of like reputation in a way. One is actual, like, legitimate, earned, honest credibility, which is how, well, it's kind of like, reputation. Like, legitimate earned reputation means that the person's done that stuff, and that stuff is worthy of praise. They're not just famous for being famous, they're famous because they've done, like, really impressive stuff. Credibility is the same way. One version is a person has credibility because they check the boxes of, they know their stuff, they're objective, etc. Now, there's also credibility in the sense that, just like fame in a way, that's unearned. That person is just famous. You're like, what are they famous for? It's like, you're famous for being famous. And so someone may have high perceived credibility because of irrelevant characteristics. Like, people just believe them because the source is, like, well-liked, or they're famous, or, they're pretty or something. And those are, as we'll see, those would be irrelevant. So we want to tell credibility. Now, the first thing we'll look at here is looking at just the claim itself. So when you get a claim, and it matters when you're assessing it, like, it's like how you're going to, like, if you're deciding, well, I'll use a concrete example. Years ago, when my husky was getting super old, he was having arthritis problems, etc. And some people suggested using, I think it's glucosamine, and of course there are also all these herbal supplements and stuff they sell. And since I wanted my dog to be healthy, etc., I looked into that. And so one question would be the claim itself. This herbal remedy is good for my dog. Or in our own cases, our own health. Like if you have like a health issue or health concern, or want more energy or more focus or something, and someone says, oh, if you want more energy, take green tea, or if you want more focus, take this. And you want to ask yourself, is that actually true? So how do you test claims? Well, basically in the following way. Now, this method is not foolproof. If it was, I'd never get anything wrong, but I totally do. But it works pretty well. First thing is this. You run the claim against your own personal observations if it's actually relevant. Because there's some things that we haven't observed ourselves that are beyond our ability to observe. But if it is in the realm of things we ourselves have observed, then we run it against that. Now, our own observations, of course, are not infallible. And here's kind of the weak point, that our observations can go wrong. Now, these standards or concerns apply both ways. First, when we're assessing claims ourselves based on our observations, we'd want to, if it matters enough to spend time on it, we'd want to run our observation through kind of this checklist to see, is it meeting these conditions? Secondly, when we're looking at other people, we'd want to do the same thing, to say, okay, they're saying they saw or observed this, are these factors in play and influencing their claims? Now, part of this also can contribute to our being understanding or sympathetic to others. Namely, people may not be lying, they may merely be running afoul of these problems. So someone may say they saw something and be completely honest and not lying, but be completely wrong because of these factors. Not because of any malice, but because of these factors. Now, the most common place where these factors come into play, where it really, really matters, is in the legal system, specifically the criminal justice system. Because this is how, ideally, witnesses to crimes should be assessed. And these are all factors that affect it. Now, and I'll use those as kind of some of the examples. Now, looking at people's observations, again, the first thing is we aren't infallible observers. We can be wrong. Why? What are things to consider? Well, first, of course, is the conditions of the observation. Things like available light. If it's dark, we don't see as well. If someone claims to have heard something, overheard a conversation, the question would be, what kind of noise? Was it noisy? Was it quiet? Also, obviously, distance is a factor for vision and hearing. And so the conditions matter. Now, a movie, a pretty good one, an old one though, that actually runs through this in a very, but it's worth watching, it's not like a boring logic film, is 12 Angry Men, which I think they remade, but the original probably the best. And they essentially run through these standards. For example, imagine you're like a defense attorney and someone claims to have seen your client committing the crime. And you probably ask them, well, how far away were they? Was it raining? Was it dark? And if the only witness says, well, they were about 100 feet away, it was dark, there was a street light, probably 20 feet away, and it was raining, you could probably do a pretty good job raising doubts about the person's observations. Now, the person could be completely honest. They could 100% sincerely believe they saw that person, but of course they could be wrong. And the conditions like weather, distance, and lighting would all be relevant. Now, of course, we should apply these to ourselves too. Like if we think we see something or hear something, how are the conditions? Second, people vary in their powers of observations. One thing, obvious thing is, of course, people have different, eyesight. Some people have, exceptionally good eyesight, or really good corrective lenses, or really good hearing, or really bad hearing, or really bad eyesight. In addition to, the sort of acuity of the senses, there's also the person's sort of understanding and knowledge. So someone who may not have great eyesight, but they really know, birds, they would know, even though their vision may not be that great, they have a better chance recognizing a particular bird than someone with great eyesight. Because if you clearly see something, you have no idea what you're looking at, it's going to be worse than someone whose eyesight is not as great, but they know exactly what they're looking at. And so people have varying powers. So going back to the trial example, if you're a defense attorney, you'd want to say, you might notice the witness wears big, thick glasses. You might say to them, were you wearing your glasses at that time? If the person says, well, it was raining, so I had to take them off. And you'd be like, well, how good's your eyesight? And they're like, 21 billion. They're like, well, it's not that good. Now, of course, we also want to apply it to our own cases. How good is our eyesight, our hearing, etc. Now, there's also the psychological factors. Our beliefs, our hopes, our fears, and expectations affect our observations. So there's also the psychology in there shapes what we think we're seeing. Now, this, of course, can all be completely honest. The person could be 100% wrong, but 100% honest. Because honest doesn't mean you're saying what is true, you're saying what you think is true, and you could be wrong. So what are factors that affect this? Well, one thing is wishful thinking, which we'll see as a fallacy in the future, but the idea is if you really want to see something, or really hoping to see something or observe something, we will do so. I'll give one boring example, then one horrifying example. Boring example is, I always I have a bad habit of any electronics I get or anything I get mechanical, I have to take it apart. I have to know how it works, I have to be able to take it apart, put it back together. My rule is if I own something, I got to be able to take it apart, which really annoyed my parents because I always took stuff apart, especially electronics. And they're like, that could kill you. I'm like, it didn't kill me. It's cool. And of course, there's all kinds of little tiny parts, and as you might imagine, they sometimes fall on the floor. If you're looking for that one essential piece that holds the whole thing together, and you're looking at the floor, every little tiny thing is going to look like that thing. It's like, oh, there, oh. It's like, oh, that's a piece of a roach. How disgusting. So when we really are looking for like a critical part, or we lost our keys. If you ever drop your keys like in the field, you're like, oh crap. And you're looking around, and everything looks like your keys. It's like, no, that's a piece of a can. No, that's, oh, keys to a better car. Nice. Now, here's the horrifying one. In states would have a lot of hunting, which are pretty much all the states. During the deer season, there's a phenomenon called buck fever. And it occurs when people think they see a deer, but it's not a deer. If you ever wondered, like, why do they wear like the bright orange when they're hunting? Well, the reason is, of course, because deer are not bright orange. So if you see something bright orange moving, it's not going to be a deer. So you don't shoot it. Also, anybody who grew up in like hunting areas, which I hunted, you do not wear brown, you do not wear white. Because if there's a flash of white, people are like deer, and shoot it. So you're very careful not to, anything that color. Everything should be like camo or orange, nothing that flashes white or brown, because you're gonna get killed. And every year there are people who get shot. In Maine, my home state of Maine, several years back there was a woman who was hanging her laundry, and she was wearing, I think, like white gloves. So when she's moving, it looks like the tail, because when a white-tailed deer is running through the woods, you see the little flash of the tail. And so then you kind of gauge where its shoulder's going to be, and you shoot it. Or if you're carefully hunting, you look so you can see it. But when you're really out to get that deer, like last day hunting season, then you really get it keyed up. And so she got shot and killed. And the person was acquitted because she was in a hunting area and she did look like a deer. That she should know better than to wear white gloves in hunting season. And so the people think that they're seeing a deer. I mean, I've been hunting too. I've had that happen. You're like, anything that's moving, you're like, gosh, it's got to be a deer. Got to get that deer. And you have to be really careful because even like other people look like deer, which is why you always want to wear lots of orange, because deer are not orange. They say that deer can't spot the orange. That's not true, but it's worth wearing just so you don't get shot by somebody. And of course it also affects other perceptions. People really want something, to be seeing something, hearing something. Like a good example of this, have you ever seen like the ghost hunter shows used to be pretty popular, and then they'll have like a noise and it's like whoa, and it's like, yeah, that's probably the wind in the trees. But if you listen really carefully and you really want it to be like a voice, it will sound like a voice. And that's probably just wishful thinking. Now, our biases also affect how we see stuff. Now, this could be fear. For example, this is terrible. I don't know, several terrible things. If I have a friend who's afraid of snakes, and like I'm running and going like in a park or something, I'll of course tell them it's full of poisonous snakes. And then every single twig or vine they see, they think is a snake, so they're freaking out because they're like jumping and freaking out. And occasionally they run into a real snake. But probably the worst thing I did with this was when I was in grad school. And in grad school you're like insane, so perfectly defensible. One of my roommates was terrified of roaches, their worst fear. And I don't know why I did this. I guess because grad school, because I was insane. I thought, hey, this will be funny, because I had like an hour's sleep the night before. So I took a cotton ball, wrapped it up in athletic tape, so it was all sticky. Got some shoe polish, put it on it, and you might imagine it looked nothing like a roach. And so I hid it in my hand and walked past her and flicked it into her hair, and it stuck on there. And I'm like, oh my God, Tammy, there's a roach on your head. And she freaked out. She's like screaming, ah, ah. And then of course after a while she realized that it wasn't a roach, it was just this thing. But then I locked myself in my room. She hasn't got revenge yet. Someday she's a nurse. She'll probably I'll be like 90 and she'll be like, revenge finally. Like, no. I couldn't blame it. Because I would totally deserve it at that point. Do the old Kill Bill thing. And of course, it looked nothing like a roach, but psychologically she was afraid of it, so she saw it as a roach. Now, more seriously, people's racial biases and age biases can affect how they see people, perceive people as threats. In some cases, it can be like a BS defense. People are saying, oh, I felt really terrified, because if, in the case of like police shootings and self-defense, killings, you have to say, the person has to say they were in fear for their life. And of course, they're always gonna say I was in fear for my life. But a person may be lying, but they could be completely honest, because if a person's in a situation, especially if they have like biases or fears, which we all do, they can perceive behavior as super threatening. Like if people think there's danger or something going on, everyone, like if you heard that there was like a serial killer on campus masquerading as a student, you'd be more wary of other students, because you'd be looking at everybody's actions, suspiciously. So if someone has, biases, or if they hear there's like somebody in the area, who's armed and dangerous, they'll be looking more nervously at people. Or if someone has, everyone does, biases, so they'll perceive someone as a threat. A cell phone could also look like a gun, or a movement that's neutral could look hostile. Now, this is not to say that every case is like justified. It's just that if a person is afraid, they tend to perceive things as potentially dangerous. So if you think this is a suspect as someone with a gun roaming around, and you see someone pulling someone out of their pocket, your mind says potentially a gun, even though it may just be a phone. And of course, in some cases, it's just a lie. they knew that they were just shooting somebody. Now, this includes obviously ethnicity, also like age. I remember my first experience with this was years ago when I was in high school. We were trying to get money to go to Europe, which you never did, because Europe's really expensive, but we were basically begging for money as students. And the local grocery store, Shop and Save, let us go there and beg. And I was paired up with my friend Gopal, and we were both on track, and we played Dungeons and Dragons, and so we were like super nerds. Like we were both athletes on track, but track is the nerdiest of sports. You're just sports nerds. And so we're there, and no one's getting close to us. And this is our hometown, and the people are like avoiding us. And Miss Marley, the English teacher, she comes down and says, "What are you doing?" We're like, we're begging for money. She's like, you two guys can't be together. You're scaring the old people. They're gonna think you're thugs. I'm like, what? It says you got to have one person and a girl, because that way you don't seem everyone's gonna pair up with a girl, so you don't seem terrifying. And so we changed it, so you always had to have like this young guy, because teenagers are terrifying to old people, and a girl, because they're less terrifying. And once that was switched up, then we were less terrifying. And of course, as I said, we're on track. We're high school, pre-college students. We are on debate team. We play Dungeons and Dragons. We are the least thug entities possibly possible. But in a way, we thought it was kind of cool. It's like, yeah, we're thugs, which we totally were not. We were nerds. But still terrifying to old people. I'm waiting for that day to happen when I start finding young people terrifying. One day it's going to tip over and it's going to be like, these young people, they're so scary. Yeah, because one day you're the young kid, the next day you're yelling at the terrifying kids to get off your lawn with their hoverboards. Now also, to give some final examples of how biases affect people's perceptions, sexism. One thing that studies claim is that if a woman in a meeting gives an idea, people tend to ignore it. If a man gives the same idea, they'll say it's a good idea. And as a final example, there's the famous term from this study where they took a paper, same paper, and they just changed the name on it to make it like male or female names or ethnic focused names. And if the name sounded like a white guy, it was graded very high. And if it was from a woman, graded low, or a different non-white ethnicity, graded lower as well. And they've done similar things with job applications, just changed the same resume, different names. Yeah, and so people's biases affect how they see things. Now this can also go positive. For example, everyone's probably experienced this. You've got a friend who's dating someone terrible, and they see the person as just, they don't see any of their flaws. They're like, oh, they're the greatest. And you're like, no, this person's terrible. Later they realize they're terrible. But during the time, they see everything they do as good. Or like when people have, their pet, their pet is clearly terrible, doing terrible things, but like, no, I don't, it's great. Now, despite all these flaws, it's still our best source of information. Now, on the side of good, to recap, what you want to do if it's important enough, in your own case, is kind of run through a checklist. Especially if it's like really important. So for example, with police, they're trying to give them training so they kind of do this. That they run through like, okay, I have this bias, am I in danger, should I be shooting this person? And that's really important because that's literally life or death. Also for like hiring, same sort of thing. They try to train people so they overcome their biases, ethnicity, and gender, etc., so they make better decisions. So in our own case, we'd want to say, if it's important enough, like we're trying to decide whether to shoot somebody or not, or hiring, to run through and say, am I falling prey to these? Also, again, when assessing professional context, like if you're considering law, this is basically basically witness assessment 101. This is what you battle over. So next time we'll pick up, we're looking at background information. So have a good rest of the day, and I'll see you in the future.